ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to find seats and we will get started now. Thank you.
Energy is something we use to do things, to heat things up, to
make stuff work.
something that makes our life easier. Hi, I'm Sovina.
And my name is Oscar.
And today we're going to tell you about the energy transition according to DNVGL. The energy transition is happening really, really fast.
When I am as old as my mum and dad, nearly half our energy will be from renewables, like wind power.
We will be using fewer dead dinosaurs and old plankton to make energy, but still a lot of gas.
And then this one connects to this one.
We'll be using much more electricity in the future. Most of it will be from the wind and the sun.
Only some of it will be from lemons.
2, 1.
I'm endeavoring to take a driving test because cars could be driving themselves when I'm older. But if I do buy a car, it will probably be electric.
In 2050, more of us will be living in cities, and owning a car will feel so 2019. Most of us will be taking public transport or using a small electric vehicle like this one.
I think the car will be electrically and not driver and maybe fly.
Adults always say we need to save money, so they'll be really, really happy with the next one.
This is how much the world spends on energy now. But in the future, we will be using much less.
By 2050, carbon dioxide emissions will be down by half.
But that's not enough to stop our planet from warming up too much.
I am worried about climate change because I am a little bit afraid for live when we can't live here anymore.
We have no planet B. We have one planet we can live on.
If we destroy it, it's not ours anymore. But we can do something. It's not too late.
Yeah, thank you to the children. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to the Guildhall. Welcome and good morning to the launch of DNVGL's 2019 Energy Transition Outlook. My name is Ulrike Haugen. I'm DNVGL's Chief Communications Officer. The Guildhall is described as London's powerhouse since the 12th century. And DNVGL, with its 12,000 engineers and 155-year-old history, also likes to call itself powerhouse, a knowledge powerhouse. And that's why we're here today, to give you the latest insights into our research on the energy transition that our planet is undergoing in the coming 30 years. And it's actually the third time we're here in London, so it's really becoming a tradition. A big thank you also to our guests from the maritime sector that are prioritizing our launch in a very busy London International Shipping Week. We've prepared a program for you that should give you food for thought and a basis for good discussions when you're leaving here today. We will first hear from our Group President and CEO, Remy Eriksson, about the findings and the highlights of the 2019 report, followed by a panel with experts and special guests from the industry, technology, and the finance sector. And we will then hear from our CEO for energy, his insights from the energy sector. But before we can get started, I need to point out to you the emergency exits. So if you hear the bell, then please leave the building and follow the Guildhall staff's announcements. But may I now ask the DNVGL's Group President and CEO to join me here on stage. Join me in welcoming Remy Eriksson.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the 2019 launch of our Energy Transition Outlook. So let me dive straightly into the key findings of this year's edition. We forecast a very rapid transition unfolding within a time span of 1 generation. Existing technology can deliver on the Paris Agreement, but only with broad and strong policy backing. Global energy use will peak in the 2030s owing to energy efficiency. And the fourth one, the transition is affordable, as was pointed here also by the children, because the world will be spending a lower percentage of its GDP on energy needs than it does today. The third edition is not merely an update. Over the past 12 months, we have been doing quite a lot of work on key aspects of the transition. And I would like to particularly point to 2 things. The first one was to create an electricity market model, where we model prices received at hourly intervals to understand the impact of large amounts of variable solar and wind. And we looked much deeper into the electrification of the road transportation by enhancing the modeling of key factors such as cost, range, and charging, which means that we have now much more accurate results of likely uptake rates of electrical vehicles around the world in the 10 world regions that we are looking at. Our Outlook report comprises the main report, as shown here, where we describe how the world energy system will change throughout the next 30 years. We also produce, like we have done previous years, supplementary reports where we describe the impact of this transition that we describe in the main report on the 3 core industries of our company, namely maritime, oil and gas, and power and renewables. And also to provide transparency, we also give free access to all of our data through our digital platform Veracity, given here on this slide. I can assure you that it's not an easy task to model the world energy system, to model the demand and supply, and the use and exchange of energy within and between the 10 world regions. To do this, we have created a research unit focusing on energy transition. Our researchers then collaborate with more than 100 of our people working in the operating units of our company. And these people are working with our customers every day to verify, assess, and give advice on infrastructure that are being built today that will provide the energy system that we see over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Our research team also interacts with the dozens of people from businesses around the world and also academia. DNVGL is, as you know, an independent third-party provider of assurance and risk management services. And I like to think this independence characterizes our work in forecasting too. And we choose to present one forecast, pointing at the future we think is the most likely one. and not a range of scenarios like many other forecasters do. However, no one can claim a fully neutral perspective, and if you lean towards anything, it is being technocentric. In our view, the technology that will deliver the rapid transition already exists. Here we are talking about developments in wind turbines, in solar panels, battery storage, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen and other new fuels, and so on. And our forecast does not reach for a magical solution or a revolution like breakthroughs in nuclear fusion and the like. Rather, it is the fast reducing cost of existing technologies which makes the big difference in our model. The great uncertainty, though, is the rate at which these technologies are being adopted and the strength and the breadth of the policies backing these technologies. Because let me say up front that even though we predict a very rapid transition within the space of one single generation, our forecast does not foresee a world on track to meet the ambitions of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to well Celsius by the end of this century. The emissions associated with the forecast I'm about to describe indicate a global warming in the order of 2.5 degrees, and that should set a few alarm bells ringing. Let me turn then to some specific of our report. We predict a rapid decarbonization of the world energy system with the split between fossil and non-fossil fuel roughly around 50-50 by the end of the 2040s. And this is in stark contrast to the 80-20 split that we have today, 20% non-fossil, 80% fossil, and that moves from 20% non-fossil to roughly 50% non-fossil by mid-century. The transition is also characterized by decoupling, and energy use has historically been following the population and the economic growth. In the next 3 decades, we expect the world population also to grow, and we will expect the world economy to grow quite significant. In our model, as much as 130% by over the next 30 years. Yet at the same time, a growing, more prosperous world will use less energy and emit less CO2. A defining feature of this transition is that we expect final energy demand to peak in the 2030s. At that point, humanity will start to use less energy on an aggregated level to do even more useful work for increasingly more people. So why does energy peak? The answer lies in the accelerated reduction in energy intensity, and that's energy consumption per unit of GDP. The accelerated efficiencies gains that we see are mainly associated with electrification, and particularly electrification in end energy use. Take this example on this slide here. A LED light bulb is 50 times more efficient than the kerosene lamp it replaces. In domestic cooking and heating, the replacement of biomass by natural gas and electricity yields tremendous efficiencies. So too will the uptake of heat pump technologies in manufacturing. This chart shows what energy demand will look like in 2050 without any energy efficiency gains. If you then subtract forecasted efficiency gains for transport, buildings, and manufacturing, you get to the demand for energy in mid-century. And as you can see here, it is the electrification of the road transport sector that yields the greatest efficiency gains here. Unpacking that, you can see here that we expect a rapid uptake of electrical vehicles, and by 2032, EVs, electrical vehicles, will represent half of all passenger new car sales globally but of course with large regional differences. Despite a growth in car sharing and semi-automated driving, the world's car fleet will expand with as much as 75% by 2050. But because EVs are more than 3 times, again here we're talking about energy efficiency, EVs are more than 3 times more efficient than counterparts. Some would claim close to 4 times more efficient. Energy use from road transportation will be marginally lower in 2050 than it is today. Electrification in the heavy vehicle segment will be somewhat slower, owing to, of course, bigger batteries and the higher costs involved. Although we do expect a rapid electrification of buses in cities. In long distance and heavy trucking, we expect hydrogen to play a role, especially in countries that have already developed robust infrastructure for transport and storage of gas. This year, we have also modeled the development in the 2- and 3-wheeler category, which will account for more than 1 billion vehicles in Asia by 2030, and that is just 11 years down the road. By then, more than 70% of these 2- and 3-wheelers will be electric. The key challenge for both aviation and maritime is that they are sectors that cannot easily electrify. In aviation, biofuel uptake is likely to be enormous, and we expect this to account for almost 50% of the aviation fuel mix in 2050. In maritime, the IMO, or the International Maritime Organization, has set a target of 50% reduction in emissions in absolute terms by 2050, and this compares to 2008. If you translate that into per ship, it's in the order of 70% reduction. This chart also shows the effect of the IMO's sulfur cap regulation coming into effect 1st of January 2020. The yellow part, or actually the pink part on the screen. We expect the emission goals in maritime to be met through a combination of different measures, such as slow steaming, better asset use, energy efficiency, massive fuel shifts to lower carbon and eventually zero carbon fuels, such as LNG, LPG, ammonia, biofuel, hydrogen, and also electricity for short sea shipping. So electrification is a major theme in our forecast. We expect electricity as an energy carrier to more than double over the next 3 decades. And as you know, electrification is a big driver for energy efficiency. By mid-century, almost 2/3, 63% of the world's electricity will be supplied by solar, PV, or wind. This large share of renewables requires, of course, considerable more flexible systems here, and that means huge increase in storage, and we expect that storage capacity in the grid expanding nearly 50-fold. Power grids will be vastly expanded, and if there is one word to be used to characterize the future grid, it is complexity. By 2050, we are looking at an energy system that connects 40,000 utility-scale solar PV power plants, 12,000 onshore wind farms, 5,000 offshore wind farms, and 3 billion electrical vehicles. The grid almost triples in size by 2050, and that is measured in voltage kilometers, but it will be made greatly more efficient through digital control technologies. So in that way, you can say digitalization that we are all facing these days is a key enabler for the decarbonization that is already starting to happen. So where does all this electricity leave the primary energy sources? On this chart, you can see how coal gives way to renewables and gas, falling to 10% of the energy mix by 2050 from 27% today. Oil plateaus mid-2020s and declines rapidly after 2030, mainly as a result of the decarbonization of the transportation sector and again, the road transportation sector. Gas takes over from oil as the biggest resource in 2026 and remain fairly flat after that. And the staying power of gas, where does that come from? Well, gas is rather competitive as a backup source for variable renewables, particularly solar, and also its cleanliness relative to coal and oil. On the renewable side, we see that PV will grow 45-fold to 2050, onshore wind 10-fold, and offshore wind 140-fold, all of them from a low base though. And this tremendous growth is coming from what we call high-cost learnings. We see 19% learning rates for batteries, 18% for solar, and 16% for wind. What does these numbers mean? Well, for each doubling of installed capacity, the cost will fall by these percentages. So in the range from 15 to 20%, the cost will come down for every doubling of installed capacity. So mature technologies will take a lower time to double, etc. So ahead of us, ladies and gentlemen, lies a very rapid transition, but the transition is not fast enough for Paris. This chart shows that we expect emissions to peak in 2025, 6 years down the road. Worryingly, emissions continue well after mid-century. For example, in the year 2050 alone, the world's energy system will emit 18 gigatons of CO2, and at that time, we will only have a contribution from CCS of around 1 gigaton of CO2 per year. With these emission levels, we exhaust the 1.5-degree budget in 2028, 9 years from now, and the 2-degree budget in 2049. We have quantified what can be done to close the gap between our forecast and the energy future required to prevent dangerous level of global warming. And we conclude on 3 things here. Generating all electricity from renewables from this day will not be enough. Reducing the energy intensity I was referring to earlier, twice as fast as we predict, might just squeeze us in within the 2-degree limit. But efficiency gains of that order of magnitude, we think, is not technically feasible. Capturing and sequestering the emissions, all emissions from coal and gas-fired power, also will not bring us safely home. In short, we need a combination of all of this to reach the climate goals, and not just a little bit of everything, but a very large amount of each of these 3 things: renewables, energy efficiency, and carbon capture and storage. Some energy outlooks achieve the climate goals by postponing action for the latter half of the year by introducing massive net negative emissions. In our view, such delayed actions carries unacceptable risks, particularly the threat of triggering any number of tipping points, such as, for instance, the premature melting of the permafrost, which will release an unimaginable amount of methane. The good news in this story is that owing to the efficiency gain that I've been talking about, the world will be spending an percentage of its GDP in 2050 than it does today. It goes from around 3.5% to 1.9% of global GDP. This leaves extra money on the table to engage in extraordinary actions on climate mitigation actions, should society so choose. The technologies, 1.5-degree target under the Paris Agreement, do exist. If they are deployed rapidly, their cost will fall quickly, setting up what we call a self-reinforcing effect. But this can only succeed if policies enabling the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement are dramatically enhanced, and I would say implemented, not just stated, but also implemented. We are heading towards a very different energy system than what we are used to. And this is only within a space of 1 generation. The transition is certainly a source of risk, but a cleaner and a more efficient energy system opens up also many opportunities, both for business today and, with some wise stewardship from all of us, for generations to come. And to leave where the children was leaving us, so we can really do something, it is not too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Remy, for introducing the highlights of the report to us. I would now like to introduce you to CNBC anchor and moderator Carolyn Roth. Carolyn has covered events for CNBC like the World Economic Forum, and she will moderate our panel, challenge our panelists on what to do with the energy transition, and introduce them as well. Please join me in welcoming Carolyn Roth.
For your contribution as well. I'll do my very best to ask the most intelligent questions, but I know you are the real experts. So please do come in with your contribution, your inputs, your critical questions. You can do that at the end of the panel, but also throughout. So if you see something, hear something that you agree or disagree with, that you don't like, raise your hand. You can also shout if you want. We're not quite the House of Commons, but you can do your very best. I'll try and do my best impersonation of John Burso. I don't want to resign anytime soon, but anyways, that's what we're going to do. Let's invite the panelists on the stage in the order of where they're going to be sitting. John Morea, the CEO of SGN. Then next up, Morten Hug, Chairman of Hug LNG. Mark Dooley, Global Head of the Green Investment Group. Andrew de Rosero, Industry Executive at Microsoft. Deirdre Michi, Chief Executive at Oil Gas UK, and last but not least, Knut Ørbæk Nielsen, the CEO of DNV-GL. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's sort out the technical issues first. This is a live presentation. This is what happens. I want to make sure we hear everyone on the panel. All right, we are ready to go. Let's start with shipping, because we heard it from Remy. This is an industry that is very difficult to electrify. On the other hand, the good news from the report is that shipping is already the most energy efficient mode of transport, but there are more challenges for the industry. Obviously, there are a lot of caps to meet the sulfur cap or the IMO target of 50% greenhouse gas emission reductions. Morten, let's kick things off with you. Is it feasible to achieve these targets given the environment we're in?
Well, I'm optimistic, and I think that for deep sea shipping, as you pointed out, the technological solutions for getting to zero carbon, they don't really exist yet, and they're certainly not commercial. We don't have the solutions, but the industry as a whole is very committed to developing and finding those solutions. And if we are to achieve the reduction by 2050 on an absolute level of the CO2 emissions from shipping, it basically means that zero-emission ships will need to be ready to be built, but also be commercially viable by 2030. So we don't have the solutions. We have the work cut out for us, and basically the next decade will be very important in getting there.
Knut, we heard it there. We don't have the solutions yet. There's a consensus that we need to reach those targets. There's no consensus really on how the industry will get there. What do you think is the silver bullet? Is it LNG, or what else could it be?
Well, it's always difficult to find the silver bullet. I think what the IMO has really set for the industry is a very ambitious target. And it is, like Morten says, something that the industry needs to adapt to. We don't have the solution. There is no silver bullet how to get there, but I think we have a very good starting point. And as Remy demonstrated with the charts, there is abundance of gas, and that will be with us for a long time. The technology to use gas as fuel is mature. We are building the infrastructure. So I'm quite optimistic that that will be a very important piece of the puzzle going forward.
At DNV, you've certified a large number of LNG fueled ships and vessels. Tell us, what are the main advantages?
Well, I think I already alluded to some of it. When you are introducing new fuels, I mean, the technology has to be mature. We've been working in the industry with LNG as fuel for a very long time. We have the operational experience. We also are building the infrastructure, which is really important. If you think about some of these new fuels, that might be one of the chosen fuels for the future, still you will need an infrastructure to support ships that are trading worldwide. So gas is really taking away a lot of the emissions already. I mean, on the SOx, on the NOx, on the particle matters. It is already giving in the order of 20% reduction on the CO2, which goes to prove that it is a really viable alternative.
It's viable, but is it also cost competitive, Morten? Does it make sense price-wise?
I think LNG as a marine fuel is just at the tipping point. So it's being adopted in certain regional trades, Northern Europe, for instance. It's being adopted now for very large container ships. The first crude oil tankers with LNG propulsion are being built. The first few have been put into service. The issue for sort of accelerating sort of mass adoption, there are several challenges, but the main one is that the additional cost of making the main engine or the propulsion system compatible with LNG and to have LNG storage tanks on board and so on, the extra cost or capex required is still quite substantial. So even if you have all the environmental benefits, both in terms of air emissions and CO2 efficiency, as well as cost savings, given where LNG is priced in the markets at the moment, it still doesn't fully make up for the fact that you have to invest in a much more expensive vessels. But this is being developed, it's being adapted, and learning effects, as we heard about earlier, will bring those costs down. And I think that we will see a rapid acceleration of new orders for LNG ships. Two other points. One is the required infrastructure for fuel, which is basically a chicken and egg problem. Nobody will invest in LNG bunkering infrastructure if there aren't ships demanding that kind of fuel, and vice versa. Nobody will dare to invest in LNG-fueled ships if they don't think that they can get the fuel where the ships are trading. In my mind, that has been a real challenge, but it's basically behind us. It's being addressed, and for the main trading routes, for large vessels, there is now LNG available. The final point is, of course, if LNG comes in and is competitive as a source of fuel, both in terms of the cost of the vessels and in terms of the operating cost of the fuels, basically the existing fleet with more traditional internal combustion engines basically becomes obsolete. So there is a reluctance, I think, for a lot of owners to invest in new technology, because it basically means that their installed base, their existing vessels, are obsolete. But over time, the forces of gravity or the economic laws will basically make this happen.
You make a lot of very viable points. Knut, before we move on to other issues, what about safety? You've done a number of safety feasibility studies. Is it safe enough? I mean, there are so many crews that are inexperienced with LNG. You have to train them. You have to trust them too.
I would say that gas as fuel is a safe option. With anything, you have to train the crew on board to deal with the challenges of whatever type of operation, whatever type of fuel they're carrying. So that is nothing that is particular about, say, gas as fuel. We as an industry, know how to deal with this. There are very few accidents involved with LNG carriers. It's a very safe option. I would say that if we were to think about safety, it's really what we need to keep in mind for the future options. And that is, I think, a very important point, that whenever we are developing new solutions, more immature solutions, we need to really make safety at the core of these developments.
Let's move on and let's talk to Deirdre. You're here to represent the oil and gas industry in the UK, and the report again makes it very, very clear that the importance of oil as an energy source is shrinking. At this point, it's 29%, it'll drop to some 17% in 2050. Electrification, we heard it so many times, that's the future. How do you feel about these forecasts? How do you feel about this report, which is obviously not great news for your industry?
Yes, so it's interesting, and you know, it's good that DNVL have come out with a forecast rather than scenario, because obviously others do scenarios, they've got a bit of wiggle room. So good on you for actually getting really specific. And I think all the scenarios, the forecasts show that actually there is going to be a reduction in oil as part of the energy mix. And in the UK, we certainly anticipate that. So currently we're 75%. Oil and gas makes up 75% of the demand. We see it going down to about 2/3 in 2035 and 1/3 by 2050, when we are committed as a country to be net zero by that point. So I think we understand that, and we know that actually oil will still be part of a diverse energy mix, and that's the future we're heading into, and that's the one we're looking to adapt to, recognizing that gas will also play a key role in that. But I think one of the things that we've all got to be really clear about is that oil will continue to contribute to the way we live, whether it's in my iPad and the composites that make up electric cars. We talk about electrification a lot. We are going to need oil to make up the composites that make up the cars that will be powered by electricity. So we are part of a future that involves a diverse energy mix. And I think we're all clear about that and moving into action to support it.
Obviously, your industry is not getting the best reputation in the energy transition debate, and there have been so many protests and they've been telegraphed in the media. There's very little you can do about that, I guess, but you have been quite vocal. You said, hey, we're not the baddies, we're not the enemies, we can actually play a vital role in leading the energy transition. And let me challenge you here a little bit, because obviously that seems a bit counterintuitive, that seems a bit ironic in a way. How exactly does the oil and gas industry want to achieve that and do that?
So I think we can do that in a number of ways. Last week, we launched our Roadmap 2035, which was all about a plan to how we deliver a net zero and contribute to a net zero economy by 2050. And it's about making sure that as an industry, we are very clear about our emissions and our footprint. We currently, again, in the UK, contribute about 3% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So we're focused on reducing those. But we can also play a role. We've heard so much about what the need for carbon capture and storage and the hydrogen economy. And given that our focus is on reservoirs and pipelines, we have the skills and the expertise to help develop that industry going forward. So our role is twofold as we go forward.
I want to pick up on the point of CCS, and I want to ask everyone really, and the panelists, is that the panacea? Because if it goes well, yeah, you can capture up to 90% of the carbon dioxide emissions produced from the use of fossils. If it doesn't go well, it's very costly, it's very energy and water intensive. Does it make sense?
So can I take that? Because I think it does, but I think you're right. It's a range we have to be thoughtful about. It's not a silver bullet. It's back to the efficiency approach. It's back to bringing in things like carbon capture. It's about adapting new technologies. So there is no one thing that's going to solve this for us.
I agree with that. Certainly not a panacea, but a critical part, essential part of giving us a chance of hitting the challenges that are outlined in the report. And I'd say on top of that, that the oil and gas industry has a unique ability to champion that. The technical challenges that CCS asks are only second nature only to one industry in the world, the oil and gas industry, and only one industry in the world will be able to move with any self-assurance into delivering these projects. So there's, in CCS and I think also in hydrogen, there is a very special skills-based reason for oil and gas to be at the fore.
Martin, you were...
Yeah, I'm I guess a bit skeptical of CCS. Think of this example. The reason why somebody, particularly in the emerging world, would consider building a new coal-fired power plant is because it's very cheap. And if you then add in CCS as part of a new project, it makes it very expensive. CCS is an expensive technology for new build power plants, but even more so for retrofitting. But just consider the new built example. So then you go, you basically increase the cost by multiples by adding CCS in. And then the alternative would be, okay, from having the most cost competitive alternative without it to having a very expensive one, well then you would rather consider other cost competitive alternatives, which could be solar or it could be wind. So I think that the market mechanisms around it, at least without very significant sort of government incentives, will limit the uptake of CCS.
John.
So my view is that for the UK to hit net zero, CCS is a must. I mean, there's some talk about, for instance, the biomass stations actually capturing the carbon and actually having negative emissions, because that will be needed for us to hit net zero. I also think that we as a country and probably as a planet need to get on with what I would term industrializing CCS, because I mean solar and wind have had a lot of effort put into them, and we've seen the costs come massively down. Now, if we have that sort of focus on carbon capture, I'm sure the costs quite rightly are there at the moment will come down as well. So I think CCS is a tool, and a very, very important tool to hit net zero.
The challenge is not in the mature economy, but it's in the emerging world. So when India is moving up the economic development curve and Africa eventually comes, unless they can grow their economies and increase their energy production based on clean and CO2 efficient solutions, it almost doesn't matter what the mature world does.
So can I add to that? So I think everything you're saying is right, but that shouldn't stop us taking the lead, because as you say, as we as we develop it, as we kind of cookie cut it and we learn and we reduce the cost, then we can hopefully share it. But recognizing there are developing parts of the world that want to have the lifestyle we have, and so they should. But then we should be in action to reduce the impact that we have, and then hopefully, first, take that advantage and take those learnings and apply them more broadly.
But one of the problems that I see is that big emitters, like the US, for example, they don't even mention CCS in their climate goals or in their plan of action. Why is it not universally recognized if it's such an important tool, as you say, John? Anyone?
It's had a checkered history, then that's been kind in terms of delivery. We're active on thin way on CCS in the US, and it's got nothing to do with government policy. It's driven by thought leaders in the oil and gas industry, galvanized by the need for them to change their own footprint, own carbon footprint, and excited by their own capability to make this technology work. And let's face it, that's the threshold that CCS has to clear in order to quell the skepticism you can sort of hear on this stage, which is legitimate. The whole groundswell of action in this endeavour we have is decoupling from government policy, happily in that country and my own native country, Australia, where you're not always getting the right signals that you would want on this mission. So oil and gas players are going to make it happen, and we're working with them in the US.
Deirdre, let me come back to you. Oil and gas, currently called big oil, essentially, big oil and gas. You think in 20, 30 years from now, we're no longer going to call them that, but big energy, that's the big term because they can successfully adapt?
Absolutely. And again, I think if you look at the history of this industry, we've been very good at adapting. We're resilient in kind of moving forward, dealing with the challenges. This is another challenge that we can rise to. We're already seeing companies, picking it up. Some of the big household names, Shell, BP, Total, they're already in that space. And then our supply chain that supports these companies are way ahead. They see the opportunity and they see that actually a diverse energy mix is something that they can contribute to. So I see an evolution of these companies in support of the evolving energy mix.
I read a report from Goldman Sachs. Obviously, these are very smart guys and they get paid a lot of money, so I hope what they say is true. They say big oil they've been vertically integrated in oil from production to retail for a century. Of course, we know that. They now believe in the coming decade we'll see them integrating vertically in gas and power, and obviously they have deep pockets, they have very strong balance sheets. So all of a sudden, they're going to try and eat someone else's lunch, aren't they?
Well, what would I say about that? I would say that it's competition, and I would say that that should be good, because if they are going after other people's lunch, as you call it, then that will make everybody sit up and pay attention and get smarter and more efficient if they're going to stay ahead of that competition coming in. I think it should be a good thing.
John, are you afraid of that competition?
Well, I think that my industry, which is gas distribution, works very closely already with the gas and oil majors, and actually together we desperately want to make our product more carbon friendly, which is why I've been talking about carbon capture, and we're working with the majors on, will hydrogen be a carrier for the future? So I don't really see that competition element. If it's focused in the right things, in the right ways about innovating technology to make things more cost effective, so we can actually help decarbonisation, then I think it's a great thing. But also, I think it's a great thing that we are collaborating to make sure that we can hit net zero.
So you would say the addressable renewable market is big enough for big oil to enter that space as well? You think there's enough for everyone, essentially? The pie is big enough?
Well, I haven't got the figures, but I think I saw something the other day. There's going to be billions of pounds spent on going zero carbon in the UK. And then if you then multiply that by all the countries that want to go net zero eventually, I think the space is big enough for all.
Mark, how do you feel about that? Because at this point, big oil, we buy it as an investor because we want the capital returns, we want the dividends, we want the share buybacks. They make a lot of money. They have very, very deep pockets. As they move to non-fossil, will they still deliver that, you think?
I'm as excited as I am about the impact oil and gas can have in those newer technologies, and as galvanized as those boards must be about the need to chart a path into decades out to 2050 and beyond. It's a very big transformation to shift from the economic proposition they have for their shareholders at the moment, where they take exploration and production risk and go to market risk, and they produce the returns that are associated with this, and they do it in huge volume, tens of billions of dollars of capex every year, kicking out returns in the mid to high teens, let's say. Renewables and power, the electricity industry generally is a lower return market than that, and even very handsome success rates in getting money out the door in renewables will still be seeing them, $2 or $3 billion a year would be a pretty solid effort. So they've got to sell a very big and very different idea to their shareholders. They've got to say, forget 15 to 20%. Hello, high to mid single digits, mid to high single digits, and we're just not going to be getting as much money invested anymore as we used to. It's a big shift.
Deirdre, is that a sobering reality in a way?
I think it's a reality, and I think that's okay. And it's a recognition that it's better to be in that business than not to be in business at all.
Let's move on and let's get back to John. And I want to bring up the big H word, hydrogen. The report says decarbonization through hydrogen will come at a huge cost, in part because of conversion losses. And if we talk about the uptake of hydrogen, the report sees hydrogen uptake in heating, but to a very limited extent in heavy transport and shipping, and no uptake in the passenger segment. John, do you get the sense that this report is really just way too gloomy on the uptake?
I think if you take the UK, I think I would broadly agree that the electrification of certainly cars is probably the initial way forward, and that's partly because of the lack of hydrogen infrastructure. I think from a heavy goods vehicle perspective and buses perspective, if you've got centralized depots, then that has more chance of getting hydrogen into those vehicles. And in some projects that we're doing in Aberdeen, as an example, there's work going on to try and get hydrogen into that city. So I think coming back to the cost of hydrogen, well, I think we've got to look at, if you want to decarbonize, there's going to be a cost in all pathways. And I think you've got to look at what's on the other side of the equation if you don't do anything, which is, we saw what the kids were saying, right? So there's a cost of not doing something as well. I think hydrogen will get cheaper. We've seen solar and renewables as they've been industrialized get cheaper. So I think hydrogen will get cheaper. I think hydrogen has an advantage over some other fuels because actually the customer proposition is more palatable. The reason I say that is because a hydrogen boiler looks exactly like a gas boiler. There's hydrogen boilers actually being produced at the moment by Worcester Bosch. I was there last Friday, and they should be ready for production, mass production, 2022, 2023. So from a customer perspective, the capital cost from a customer is low, and it's the same as they've got at the moment. From a distribution perspective, if you can repurpose the gas networks, again, you've got the distribution system there to transport hydrogen. So the big ticket item for me is how you get production. And I think you'll find that BEIS, certainly in the UK, have got competitions out at the moment in all different elements of the value chain to try and stimulate that innovation so that we can get some great answers to understand whether hydrogen is a goer. Sort of by the mid-20s, and the work that's going on at the moment is to get that evidence base so the policymakers can make some good decisions.
A lot of very important points, but I want to come back to the shipping guys because the report sees uptake in shipping. Knut, am I crazy to ask or to assume that at some point in the near future, a large vessel will be fully powered by hydrogen?
Nearly crazy.
Nearly crazy. Okay, just a little bit. Why not?
I think we have to take a stepwise approach to this. So hydrogen shouldn't be ruled out, but I think it's important to target the right segments. And naturally, the short sea shipping segment is the one that should be sort of piloting this as a solution. But to me, this is a little bit like jumping way too far into the future. We should still research it. It's still an interesting option that should be tested, piloted. For deep sea shipping, I don't really see this as a viable alternative for a very long time.
Morten, agree, disagree?
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I think that there are some very profound sort of safety issues, fuel handling, fuel storage in the marine environment that are complicated to figure out. So of course it will be on the horizon, and there may be solutions that are developed, but they won't come from the shipping industry or be adopted by the shipping industry first, I think.
Mm-hmm. John talked a lot about some of the limitations, infrastructure-wise, but also policy-wise. What's the biggest sticking point? What's the biggest caveat to introducing hydrogen at this point? Is it the infrastructure, just because we need, if you take a look at the size of the reformers we would need and the warehouses and the mere, challenges infrastructure-wise, and who's going to fund this? Is it the government? Is it private businesses? Deirdre, you're nodding your head. What do you see as the biggest challenge?
So I think all those things you articulated. So I think technically it's starting to be proven. I think then we do need to work with governments to be clear about the policy levers that can be put in place and the kind of regulation that will help to stimulate it and look to see where it can be developed, linking it to the existing infrastructure. But I do think it's a challenge. But like colleagues have said, there are various consultations out where people are looking to see, well, how do we move forward in this space? But it is, nobody's underestimating it is a challenge.
Mark?
It's if you look about the dividend that governments have had for really investing, really subsidising very strongly in the technologies we now regard as absolutely proven and daily things, wind and solar, and that dividend being in declining cost. If we want to see hydrogen happen, then we need that same push from government to make that happen. So. And then we will get that declining cost. I'm legally trained, and I'm sure I'm surrounded by engineers, but I'll throw that assertion out there. But along with that declining cost of the actual technology, the way that this will have its best chance of success is recognising that it sits in an ecosystem, an energy ecosystem, that little things at the margin, powering it. Not from renewable energy you have to pay for, but from the fact that we all know that at some point, well, it's already happening. There are times when the wind's blowing everywhere, and you get paid not to produce. Well, what if you do your hydrogen production from that power, that renewable power that nobody wants? And these little things at the margin can intelligently managed by stakeholders who have a vista over that entire ecosystem. That's what transforms the economics of hydrogen, and we need to harness that kind of thinking as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to tell you about one example where hydrogen is actually being looked at. And John, you're aware of this. Northern Gas Networks, by the way, a project that DNVGL is involved in, is introducing hydrogen to 3.7 million homes in and around Leeds. And that could lead, that's what they say, to a decarbonization of heat as well as transport and power generation with minimal disruption to customers, so they claim. John, is there a reason why you haven't done something similar?
Well, first of all, we are partners in the project, so I'll put you right on that. If you take from a UK perspective, you've got to ask yourself what the exam question is. And we burn about 800 terawatt hours of gas as a country each year, right? Give or take a few terawatt hours, of which about 350 is for domestic use. And about 300 is power generation, and the rest is INC. So that's a huge amount of energy going through the gas pipes. Now, just to give you a comparison, the gas pipes carry over a year 3 times more energy than the electricity wires. On the coldest of cold days, the gas network carries 5 to 6 times more energy than the electricity wires in the UK. So the exam question really is, how can you keep people warm in the winter without
build better houses?
Well, I mean, it's a very good point, because I think energy efficiency is crucial to make this all work. I think that out of that 900 terawatt hours, there's been some research saying that energy efficiency could knock off about 20% of that total. So the exam question is, how do you, because it's all about storage, how can you store energy to hit that coldest of cold days? And that's why hydrogen has come to the fore. And we've been working with Northern Gas Networks, Wales and West Utilities, Cadent and National Grid on a project in Leeds. And what we're trying to do in Leeds, actually, is just to prove that hydrogen can be safely transported through the existing gas infrastructure. So that's the objective of Leeds. It's to make sure it's safe. We've actually got, now, the network is just one part of the value chain. We've talked about gas boilers, we've talked about production, but there's a value chain which the UK government is overseeing and making sure that each parts of those value chain are being tested for safety and to make sure that it's feasible. What we're doing, I mean, we do a fair bit of work in Scotland because SGN, one of the companies that we own is Scotland Gas Networks. And we have a project called H100. And the objective of that project is to construct a 100% hydrogen network by 2023, connect 300 to 400 homes to that 100% hydrogen network with hydrogen boilers, etc. And that, to me, is really important from public acceptance perspectives, because at that point, we'll be able to show people that a hydrogen or virtually zero carbon fuel can heat a house safely. And actually, from a customer perspective, there's no difference. So it's really important that project delivers. Just as an aside, coupled with that H100 project, we are putting bids into BEIS for the hydrogen production competition, and one of our aspirations is to feed the hydrogen into that project from offshore wind in Fife. So again, electrolyzer hydrogen into the network. So that's just one project, as well as the National Grid, the NGM project that we are working with up in Leeds. And the other project we're involved in is Aberdeen Vision, which is where we're looking at steam methane reformation, carbon capture, pushing a new hydrogen pipe down to Aberdeen, and then actually injecting hydrogen into the network up to 20%. And actually, the other thing there is having hydrogen available for transport, coming back to a question that was asked earlier on. And that tests actually quite a lot of the value chain as well, with carbon capture, SMR, etc. So I think it's a long answer to say that there's a lot of work going on to prove the concept.
And Leeds is a bit of a test case at this point.
Leeds and H100 are test cases. Because what we don't want to do, is our responsibility to make sure that if hydrogen becomes mainstream, it's safe. And that's the first thing we're doing, is to make sure it's safe. And it's really important that evidence, that good quality evidence, is produced from these projects. Because we're in R&D stage at the moment, is produced from those projects so that we can give the policymakers options when it comes to making some really big decisions, sort of mid-20s, on how the UK is going to decarbonise.
Andrew, your time has come. I haven't forgotten about you. I haven't ignored you. We've been talking about the energy transition for the last half hour. No one's really mentioned digitalization. I know we've invited you to talk about it, but you must be thinking, hey, this is crucial to the energy transition. Tell us how exactly.
I think we're seeing a huge uptake of digitalization across the energy industry, from oil and gas to power and utilities to renewables. And I'll just talk about a couple of projects to give some flavor to that. We're seeing great projects come out of Shell around using cognitive vision for health and safety. We're seeing projects at Repsol using high-performance computing to take a look at subsurface data in order to improve first time to oil or accelerate first time to oil. We're doing lots of work with Equinor around integrated operations center, again, improving the efficiency of production. So those, maybe that's on the oil and gas side. On the power and utility side, again, there are some really interesting things going on with companies like E.ON. So smart connected home, really introducing the capability for a single control system that allows consumers to understand and control all their different devices, their smart appliances, but also manage the PV cells, the EV chargers. When should I be selling back to the grid? When should I be consuming more? How can I shift my energy consumption from one to the other? And then on the renewable side, I think there's some really interesting stuff going on. So let's just take some of the work that we're doing around wind farms. They're using high-performance computing, again, to take a look at the optimal pitch and yaw of blades. But they're also looking at some other things, what is the optimal place to put a wind farm? One of the big costs in building these wind farms is the steel foundations, right? It's a huge cost. And yet, if you look at the traditional way of designing these, you take a look at a wind farm, you take a look at, which is the turbine that is most exposed to wind and weather, and you calculate the steel foundations for that one, and then you use that for the rest of them. Well, actually, if you actually figure out what is the steel foundation needed for each individual turbine, you save something like 10% of your steel costs. And that's a big number. So I think we can, in terms of the learning effects that we talked about earlier, I think we can accelerate a lot of that. And they're doing some even interesting things like taking a look at the wind currents and how they flow from one turbine to another. There's an optimal location. There's an optimal, again, positioning for that. So I think we're seeing huge amounts of digitization in the energy industry.
That said, do you get a sense that the energy industry as a whole is a little bit behind the curve compared to other industries? I saw a really interesting chart by BCG, and granted, it is 2 years old, 2 or 3 years old, but they look at to what extent industries have been disrupted by technology, have adopted technology. And the top one is obviously media. We all know about, Amazon, Netflix, then comes retail, and then comes telecom, banking. And I really hate to break it to you, but energy comes last, comes at the bottom. Does that shock you? Does that surprise you? Do you disagree? Do you think, hey, that's obsolete?
So I guess there are two sides to that. So the first one is it's much easier to make changes in a B2C environment, right? You make a change and the consumers can kind of make their changes and adapt to it. I think it's very different in a traditional or asset-intensive environment. I will say that what we've seen is a huge shift in the last 18 to 24 months. All of the energy companies are massively investing in digitization. I think if we repeated that today, we would be making a move up the chart. But I will also say that adoption is still a challenge, right? Adoption is not just about technology. You buy some technology, we flick a switch and everything starts running faster. It's a lot about change management. It's about changing the operating procedures that we have, and that takes time.
Knut, you as a company, you have prioritized digitalization, but a lot of the companies you work with, you're seeing some hesitation when it comes to adopting digitalization as a whole. Why do you think that is, and what's the potential that's hidden because they're not adopting it quickly enough?
Well, I think it was already mentioned some very good points. It's a very asset-heavy industry. It's also a very fragmented industry. So that there's, digitalization is not a goal in itself, but it's a means to, either get the goods faster, more economically, with less emissions to the destination. And I think this is where the work has just started, and we can already see that some of the forward-leaning operators in this sector is making great advances on energy efficiency in particular, making their operations more efficient. And I think there is a great potential across the whole logistics chain. There is, quite a lot of fragmented contractual parties from moving goods from A to B. So if you could have a more holistic, say, approach to the whole logistics chain, there should be great advances to be made.
So it takes a lot of investment. Some people say up to 300 billion over the next 20 years. It will also probably yield a lot of cost cuts. Some say up to 15% of the total cost base. Mark, do you think these figures are realistic? Do you think there's even more potential here?
I find it hard to put figures on it, but I think the transformation is awaiting us. There are a whole bunch of challenger energy suppliers out there whose whole existence rests on this thesis that digitization is going to transform the way people source energy and related products. It's started. The concern should be that this will be a net migration of business and customers from incumbents to a whole new group of companies. So that's going to be in parallel with this renewables revolution we're at the front end of, and which will gather pace through the next decade. That shift, we believe, will be enormous, and we're trying to feel our way into it, but I can't say we've achieved anything yet.
Maybe the others, Morten, Deirdre, John, maybe you can give us a sense of how you feel your industries, your companies are embracing digitalization, whether you think, hey, we should really be doing more, or yeah, we think we're where we want to be, where we need to be at this point. Morten.
Yeah, I would be the first to admit that the shipping industry is probably not an early adopter, not a leader in this area, but I think that individual companies and the industry as a whole sees digital tools, digitalization as basically a requirement in this day and age. The challenge for all of us is that you have to start with what you have. You have to when you run a business, you can always have an idea of what you would like to have, but you need to operate and optimize what you already have. And of course, you can add in digital tools, digital solutions to that, but the real transition happens as you transform the business, as you invest in new assets, and your old ones are taken out of service effectively.
Can I add to that? So I think back to your point, I think a lot of it is behavioural, and I think addressing that is huge. In the UKCS and the UK Continental Shelf, we've set up the Oil and Gas Technology Centre, and that's all about demonstrating technologies so that people can feel that it takes a bit of the risk out of adoption. And so we've recognised, as an industry, we are second to take on the things. So let's get a body that can help get it proven, and we're seeing that sort of start to get traction, which is really good. But I think the other thing we've got to remember is this is a competitive space. And I think digitalization advances you as a company and adds to your bottom line. So I think one thing we need to be really thoughtful about is how can we move that into the collaboration space where people can see that actually sharing ideas, sharing case studies will bring advantage not just to you as a company, but more broadly, and kind of move the whole agenda forward. I think that is also something that we need to be really pushing as we go forward.
Knut, you wanted to come?
Yeah, I was just thinking as we were discussing this item that, the use of digital twins is really quite an interesting area, I think, across many industries, because there is so much that you can do, say, in the virtual space, testing out sort of the physical asset before it's being constructed, before it's being commissioned, and that will already yield a lot of benefits with a shorter commissioning time, take out some of the, say, early errors, etc.
So I think even within shipping, we're starting to see some examples of that. So we took a client to our headquarters in Redmond, and we had our head of logistics talk about some of the things that we're doing with shipping providers, and what customers want these days. They want shipping to be as easy as ordering an Uber, right? They want, first of all, they want visibility, right? Where is my shipment today? Is there a storm on the way? What are the options that I have? So building out kind of this digital twin is an important way of being able to predict. First of all, get transparency. Second of all, predict and then simulate, right? So what are the different options that we have in terms of dealing with this disturbance?
I think that the dynamic between incumbents and people in black skivvies in San Francisco, in terms of winning the customer interface, there's only one way that's going to go. We talk about ponderous experimenting with ideas. Well, these people, they've tested an idea, it's worked, or they've thrown it out and they've moved on to the next one, while incumbents are still getting going. So that customer interface thing, it's only going to go one way. The question is how much of the value chain that sits behind that is also going to be occupied by these new entrants. And Andrew, that's your world. So those innovators, you'll know what their ambitions are.
I think there are. I think there is a huge opportunity for these small agile companies to come in and in a sense disrupt the industry. But at the end of the day, the industries that we're talking about are still very asset intensive. And I think if we can apply, if we can learn how to innovate at the speed of these startups, and we combine it with our assets, then we're in a much better position, right? I think the opportunity is with us. The question is, how will we take it up, and how quickly will we take it up?
That's a very important point. And before we open this up to the audience, Mark, I've got a final question to you, because off stage, we talked a little bit about what the selling point is of companies these days. And you seem very passionate about the point that they have to be accountable when it comes to climate change and their carbon footprint. Is that the major selling point when it comes to companies these days?
I think that as governments in the more advanced renewable sponsoring countries start to take their foot off the pedal in terms of the support they're giving, we could discuss whether it was time for them to do that or not yet, but they are. We're really pleased to see that the gap, the absence of government-sponsored business case that produces is being filled by corporates who are choosing to source their power in a way that they can demonstrate as sustainable. That's gathering speed it's been pioneered in the US, it's gathering speed in Europe in a way that we're really pleased with. We obviously have a business in Australia and it's working well there. All of that is underpinned by the sense that the management and the boards of those companies they need to be accountable to their stakeholders, their shareholders, their consumers, the communities they operate in, for the sustainability with which they energize their businesses. A virtuous phenomenon, and one that's really snowballing. I see it like health and safety. When I came to this country 16 years ago, health and safety was not really at the top of the agenda. If in 2019 you're on a board of a company and health and safety isn't the number one agenda item in every board meeting, then you probably want to think about how that company's run. That transition, that same thing is happening in sustainability, and that creates the engine for people to have business cases to give the confidence for renewables investment in the years ahead. The only caution I have is there's a lot of self-assessment that being done by businesses out there as to how green they and their assets are.
And the risk of greenwashing, as you say.
The reality of greenwashing is something that we really need to guard against. Transparency, uniformity, and rigor in the way those things are assessed is a really important thing, and something that we, the Green Investment Group, care about a lot, and we're active in green ratings. But I think that will be an activity that gets a lot of attention in the next 2 or 3 years. Greenwashing's already been called out.
Yeah. Finally, Andrew, and then we'll get to the audience.
So I think it's really important, if we're going to go the extra yard in terms of going beyond just the requirements. I think it starts at home, right? It starts inside the organization. So we see it as a differentiator. I think that companies looking to invest in technology companies, they are looking at what is your attitude towards sustainability? What are you doing at home? And I think I guess I'm very proud of some of the stuff that we're doing. We're our data centers. First of all, technology drives a huge amount of energy consumption. So supporting Bitcoin is approximately the same energy consumption as Denmark, right? The data centers in the world, currently, or the tech industry in general, consumes as much as Spain, right? So if we don't do something as
But
as
investors
technology
don't see
companies.
that yet, do they?
Pardon me?
Investors don't see that yet.
We don't see that yet, and it's partly because it's a little bit hidden, right? So data centers in general across the world, it's predicted that they will consume a fifth of the world's energy by 2025, a fifth of the world's energy. So it's a huge issue, and we need to address those. And we started very early, so we were carbon neutral by 2012. We've done, we purchase about 60%, or 60% of our energy is already from renewables. We'll hit 70% by 2023. Since 2013, we've bought about 1.5 gigawatts of renewables, which is more than is needed to power the DeLorean and Back to the Future, some people tell me. But we've gone a step further and we've said, okay, in addition to being carbon neutral through purchasing renewables, through energy efficiency, and through carbon certificates, we're actually self-imposing a carbon tax. So each of our business units actually pays $15 per ton of emissions from air miles, from operational use. And that money is being plowed into research around gas-powered data centers or underwater data centers that get energy from ocean currents and cooling from ocean waters. So I think these are some of the steps that we think are really important and that we would love to see more companies taking.
Deirdre, you must be thinking, hey, why is it that we're getting the bad reputation? It should be the Facebooks and the Amazons of this world. But anyway, let's put this out to the audience. Any questions, any comments? There you go. It's coming.
Yes, hi, I'm Stuart Broadley, CEO of Energy Industries Council. Thanks to DNVGL for a very stimulating report and great panel discussion. But I think it's missing something, which is yesterday, COP26 was confirmed to be in Glasgow in November or December next year. And of course, on the back of the government's 2050 zero carbon commitments, that's a huge opportunity for the British government to stand up, whether it's Boris or Corbyn, we will see, and say something. It's a platform, right? So my question to the panel, I have two questions to the panel. One is, what should be the one or two key technologies that you think the government should stand up and say, we commit to spend billions in this one or two technologies to take the global lead? Because all the global leaders are coming next year, it's expected to be a COP conference where global commitments will be once again made. So the new COP21 will be COP26 in terms of the ones that are referred to. So firstly, which technology or technology should the government commit to, do you think, as a panel? And secondly, how should that be funded? Should it be funded, A, of course, through legislation driving the industry, and secondly, through taxes? So which technology and how's to be funded?
Who wants to take this?
Well, I shall. The UK industrial strategy cites carbon capture as one of the things that we want to promote because we see great export opportunity. So I think we need to actually push that forward, carbon capture. I personally think hydrogen should be supported as well, as you'd expect me to say. So there would be the two areas. Carbon capture as a must, and I know we're still in R&D stage for hydrogen, but I think supporting hydrogen would be great. And I think it's an interesting question about who pays, because I think the energy transition, the question really needs to be answered about whether it's the bill payers that pay, or is it done through what I'd call general taxation, because arguably the poorest through the bill payers start to subsidize the richer people. Yeah.
So I'd agree with that. I think carbon capture and I think hydrogen, absolutely, we need to move forward in that. And I think in terms of who pays, I think government is already out consulting on that. And I think that we need to be really thoughtful about that, because we need to position it as something that people want to invest in, not feel they're being penalised for. Because I think if people feel they're being penalised for it, then I think you'll start to see investment stepping away. So it's got to be positioned as an opportunity for this country, for its supply chain, you know, for the industry going forward.
That said, I don't know if government has a lot of time and the opportunity to think about it over the next 6 weeks or so. Further questions?
I just love battery storage. Yeah, not necessarily as an investment, but as a market structural intervention that could be made, that is necessary and will have a follow-on effect of enabling and improving the business cases of renewable assets that come after. I've also invested a lot of time and credibility in tidal lagoons in the last decade, so I can't let that question go without me mentioning it.
And maybe one other thing that might be an easier approach is flexibility energy management. So demand energy response systems to make sure that the renewables that we have are being used to the best of their abilities. I think even before investing in new stuff, let's make sure that we're using our existing assets more effectively. That's one area I would start.
There was a question over there first.
Yeah. Hi, Nick Savides, I'm a journalist. The other day I was at a conference and someone said, if you mention carbon pricing to industry, it's like mentioning Voldemort to Harry Potter. So, and I haven't heard carbon pricing really mentioned. It's kind of like skirted around. So, but carbon pricing is going to change people's behavior. Where do you stand on carbon pricing?
So in terms of carbon pricing, from our point of view, we're part of the emissions trading scheme, which essentially puts, you know, a carbon price out there for industry to then be really thoughtful of. And it's certainly something that is evolving. And again, companies are very conscious of in terms of how they are planning their projects, etc. So the emissions trading scheme is something that, you know, puts carbon pricing on our agenda and indeed helps ensure that it influences the decisions that we're making.
The impact of carbon pricing is very sensitive, guess what, to where it's pricing at any point in time. And that in turn is very sensitive to the fine tuning that the regulators get to do of the demand for carbon credits. So it's probably just under the radar in terms of the impact it could have because of the way those dials are being managed at the moment. We're only a short distance away from it being priced at a level where we would perceive it having a real impact on people's behaviour.
Brian Davis from Petroleum Economist. Petroleum Review by the Institute. The oil industry is being demonised at the moment. After incidents like the Horizon, there's great distrust in anything that the industry says. How is the oil and gas industry actually to prove that it takes us seriously? Even the 3% figure, which Deirdre gives on action can be taken to electrify our offshore installations, etc., which we know is moving in the right direction, as well as we've heard that Shell is investing 1 million of capex on renewables. What is the industry really going to need to do to convince ordinary people that we take this seriously and that we're moving forward apart from shutdown? Because after all, the streets are full of cars. Everybody sees diesel cars and petrol cars. So people on one side say we need oil and gas, and at the other side they're being told we are the great monsters destroying the earth.
I think this one's for you.
Yeah, I think so. So it's a real challenge. Don't underestimate it. It's a real challenge. And indeed, you know, we worry about being demonized, absolutely, recognizing that we do still have a really positive role to play. So I think the way we move through this is by being transparent You talked about the self-assessment. Maybe, we've got to be really thoughtful about that, but actually showing that we are in action and being able to demonstrate that we are in action so that we don't then get accused of greenwashing. So I think as we go forward, we've just got to do more of that and be able to demonstrate our words in an actionable way.
There were more questions in the back before. I'll give you a few minutes to think about it, but essentially, on balance, the report says, hey, we're not moving fast enough. And I wonder, whose fault is it? We're not moving fast enough to meet the targets given to us by Paris. Who's at fault here? Is it the consumer because they're not pushing for enough change? Is it the producers, again, coming back to oil and gas? Or is it the policymakers because they're not giving us the right incentives?
I'll gladly reframe that question and say, I think it's, why look backwards? I think we need to look forwards. And I think that, the government, certainly from a UK perspective, have passed this net zero legislation, and that gives everybody that aspiration now. So I think we're all in it together. Every one of those people that you've just talked about, customers, industry, government, we're in it together because we're going to hit net zero. Otherwise, as we know, there's going to be some consequences. So I think looking forward is the way forward. And I think from what we can do from an industry perspective and from a policymakers or government perspective is that I think education is really key here. We've got to, and also making sure that information is given to the appropriate people so that informed decisions and choices can be made. And that's all I would say is let's look forward.
Martin.
Yeah, I would speak up on behalf of the sort of business community and say I don't think the finger should be pointed at business in general. I think business by and large kind of understand the challenge facing the world, understand the role of business in contributing and really driving change, really want to embrace it and turn it into an opportunity. But of course, businesses, they need to rely primarily on the available technology and on market mechanisms. And if the combination of goodwill and stated intentions, technology and market mechanisms on their own don't do enough, then you have to look to governments and policymakers for additional support. And so I would, if anything, point the blame in that direction and basically say that there's a lack of combination of the carrot and stick incentives, and at the end of the day, funding in order to accelerate the developments further. And the problem, of course, is politicians. By and large, they look at the next election cycle and worry about the next elections. And in this country, they don't even manage to figure that out and worry about all sorts of other things. And it means that running the country and thinking long term and developing these very crucial strategies simply isn't happening.
So I do think we are all in this together, to use that phrase, and I do think we've actually come quite a long way, and I don't think that's just me being half full in my approach. I think an awful lot has happened over a very short period of time, and I agree, looking forward, we will see the pace of change accelerate, and I think we will. We have to be convinced that we can make progress and that we can realize those goals that are being set for us. Otherwise, we might well just stop today. So, I'm optimistic about it, but I don't underestimate the challenge that is out there for us.
No, I just want to say that if you look to the maritime world, the IMO has set some very ambitious targets. The 2050 target, which is the most relevant in this context, is reducing the CO2 emissions by 50%. But it has also said that within this century, we shall be carbon free. So, there is no lack of ambition. I think what is really the challenge for all of us is to find ways to collaborate, to research, to develop new and better solutions. And if I mentioned before that the shipping industry is quite a fragmented industry. So we really need to come together, preferably also across different sectors, to try and research together some new and better alternatives. And I would say that it doesn't really, it's not very constructive to try and put the finger who is to blame, but it's rather more constructive to try and find mechanisms to bring people together. And here, obviously, some public funding can do a great deal of good.
So I think all three need to come together, so the customer side, the government side, but I don't think we can absolve ourselves as companies. I think the energy transition is very much on the agenda of the CEO and maybe his direct line of reports, but it's not necessarily always translating into the wider group of people. And I think there's a significant amount of change that needs to happen within our companies and our industries in order to accelerate the pace of change. We see some of the real digital leaders, they're moving away from departments to talking about tribes who are driving kind of innovation projects, driving change, driving transition projects. That goes to the core organizational structures of companies. Those are changing probably more slowly than we need to.
Okay, I need to check with you. Do I have 1 more minute for a question? 1 minute. Okay, very quick one to Mark. Given the world that I work in, business, finance, we worry about indicators of recession. We worry about CapEx being slowed down. What does this do to the energy transition? Is CapEx going to be dialed down across the board, fossil and non-fossil and renewables, or is it going to be unaffected because energy transition needs to happen regardless?
Unfortunately, capital answers its own agenda. There might be a little bit of ethical, ESG-driven investing out there, but nobody puts money out there because they feel it's their moral obligation, or not in sufficient volumes. I think the virtuous phenomenon we have going for us here is that most of what happens in renewables investment, the vast majority of it, is today seen as being a subset of infrastructure investment. Private investment in infrastructure being a place where long-dated, relatively stable cash flows meets money coming from your pension fund, from sovereign wealth funds, from insurance companies that are looking for long-dated, relatively low returns, but very stable. Now that activity, that category of capital formation is actually a bit of a safe haven when the world goes wrong. And we don't have to speculate on this. We saw in the year post the financial crisis in 2008-09 that, yep, there was a hiatus, 6 to 9 months. And then when money was flowing again, it was looking for things that answered that description that I've just given. So I would hope that in the established things where people are confident that we know how to do these sorts of renewables and make these technologies and make these business cases work, there will be some resilience. Note of caution, GDP correlated assets, heavily GDP correlated assets. It depends where you are in your subsidy or feed-in tariff regime, I guess. Didn't fare quite so well through the crisis, so airports weren't quite so resilient, for example. But this is a place where people broadly want to put their money in stormy times.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Really appreciate your contribution as well. Thank you.
So thank you to a great panel, and thank you, Caroline, for moderating an insightful discussion. Before handing the final word of the day to our CEO for DNV Energy, I would like to point out a couple of practicalities. We've got hard copy reports over there. If the main report is too heavy to take home, we've got a really nice executive summary as well, and we've got the industry reports. But in the digital world, of course, everything can be downloaded from our website. And as Remy pointed out earlier, even the data is available on our Veracity data platform. So please spread that word. And we would very much like you to invite you to our buffet lunch after Ditlev has talked. And some of you have even signed up for the afternoon to join the maritime event. But now please join me in welcoming DNV CEO for Energy, who also has the role of Denmark's Special Envoy for Climate and Energy, Ditlev Engel.
Thank you, Ulrike, and thank you to all of you for being here today. My job is try to make some closing remarks on these very big topics. So I think it's clear to everyone that the energy system in the world is changing profoundly. And what we're also seeing is that although it is changing, it is not fast enough. So the future is very much a game of how fast we all act. By mid-century, the share of electricity in the final demand mix will more than double from today's level. PV and wind represent almost 2/3 of that electricity. Half of light vehicles sold worldwide will be EVs by 2032. Oil declines steeply after 2030, replaced by electrification in most of the transport sector. Gas overtakes oil as the largest energy source in 2026. So fundamental changes are happening, but also what we experience ourselves. Some of you who were here last year may remember that I told you that in the Netherlands, we had in 2018 the hottest summer ever. And this year, I could actually, at the dashboard of my car, take it to the side and take a picture where it says 4 degrees centigrade in the middle of July. That is something that I personally think leaves an impression of what's going on. So these fundamental changes is, of course, also impacting the energy landscape. Extreme weather events, such as storms, will undoubtedly become much more frequent. In our daily work, we see customers who are now just planning for disruption of construction. They don't know what will happen, but probably something will happen. So it's a new business risk that needs to be accounted for. The transition from fossil-based to zero carbon is happening at a very rapid pace. But as was mentioned earlier, not enough to deliver on the Paris Agreement. So I think, honestly speaking, when we make this forecast, none of us at DNVGL find it a lot of fun to make a forecast that is predicting a future that we really do not want. But as also mentioned in the report, there's a lot of good news. So I would say, we are climate concerned, but we are very technology optimistic. We do have available and affordable technologies with the potential to limit the global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. And it will be a combination of many things. Over the next decade, we need to boost solar power more than 10 times and wind power more than 5 times. 50 million electrical vehicles per year will be needed by 2030, requiring a 50-fold increase in batteries and large-scale charging infrastructure. More ultra-high voltage transmission networks, annual improvements in global intensity by 3.5%, etc., etc. So a realistic and, let's say, attainable timeline is there if we act immediately. And we cannot honestly just put back and just wait. You saw on one of the slides that we said that the 1.5 degrees centigrade window will close by 2028. That is not that far away. So, and there was this question on the panel, who is going to do what? And from our point of view, it is all the ability for everybody to work together through extraordinary actions, including policy actions. So we do call for governments to expand and adapt power grids to the rise of renewables, regulatory reforms to accelerate the uptake of electrical cars, and economic stimulus for energy efficiency measures. And we also do appeal to the 197 countries that signed the Paris Agreement to raise, and it was mentioned by Remy, implement their NDCs going forward by 2020. In case you're not aware of it, but those that were submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention in the first round of the NDCs, 75% of those countries refer to renewable energy as a measure, and only 58% to energy efficiency as part of the tools they wanted to deploy. In our opinion, when this revision is going to come, which undoubtedly will be a discussion in Glasgow next year, those should be 100% for both. So our energy transition outlook supports you to develop strategic options to speed up the transition. And all of us, I think, also have to work not just with the technology, but with our mindsets. We have, all of us, to change from business as usual to business as unusual. And this, a radical approach, will of course only be successful if we really understand what technology can provide. And they are learning there as well. I think 30 years ago, when you looked at what today is described as a wind turbine, probably more described like a windmill, and people said, this is going to be the future power machine for electricity, I think most people would say, you are insane. That's not going to happen. But that's what has happened. And the same goes, for instance, for solar. So let's not underestimate what technology and newer technology ideas can do to help this going forward. And it's all about how we interact as government, businesses, and citizens together, not against each other, but working together, because it is a common responsibility that we do have. And before rounding it off, I would like for the Mindset just to share a small story that I experienced in early spring 2011 in Houston. And it was just after Bob Dudley was becoming CEO of BP. And in this, he had to address everybody in the room after the major oil spill in 2010. Not an easy task to explain to everybody what had happened, and of course not for BP itself. But during that presentation, he showed a very interesting graph. He showed the innovation rate of BP after the oil spill. And you cannot imagine how much more new ideas was created in that company during that very, very difficult time. And he said in his presentation, if I had asked our researchers to deliver that, they would have walked out or just said, we're going on strike. We cannot do that. But now they had to. And they did it because they had to. And I think this is very, very important lessons in this whole transition. It's not just about, well, let's work on it. We got to put our mind at it in a way that we have never done before, because then we can achieve things we cannot imagine when we think about it as business as usual. And please remember, there are 12,000 of us in DNVGL to help you, work with you all the time. Please reach out to us. If you do not, we might chase you down. So on behalf of all of us, in particular our president, Remy Eriksson, thank you so much for joining us, and please join us later on for informal discussion. Thank you so much.